Hello, I am Goose, and I recently found a little game by the name of Mana Spark for dirt cheap on the Nintendo eShop about a month ago. This game was made by a Brazilian company by the name of Behemoth Games, among other companies that crowd this game's credits. Considering this is their first game, and not a very well-known one at that, I feel like it deserves to be discussed, especially considering how entertained I was while playing it. I only say it's not very well-known because I wasn't able to find much about it online. I mean, I couldn't even find the soundtrack anywhere, which made giving this video proper background music kind of difficult, but I figured it out. It's one of those games where to complete it, you have to do it in one masterful run-through, rather than exploring more vast landscapes over the course of several worlds like other games. Games like this have a theme of repetition, as in the game doesn't necessarily take a long time to complete, but the complexity of the gameplay makes it take quite a few more hours to complete than average, and will end up with you replaying it over and over again trying to beat it. The main example that comes into my head when trying to compare it to another game is Enter the Gungeon, and it's also the first example that came into the heads of my brothers, who both saw me playing, although they worded it slightly more harshly than I will in this video. If you're gonna make a game like this, it better be entertaining enough to play over and over again, otherwise it's gonna become a bother to play real quick. So, how does this game stack up to other games like it? Well, I'll admit there were some rough patches throughout my whole playthrough that frustrated me a little bit. It's definitely not perfect, but what game is? It certainly is a great start for Behemoth, so I'll try not to be too harsh on them. Anyways, I'll save the rest of my opinions for the actual review, which is right now. Let's break down how I feel about Mana Spark.
Also, I tried to record the music from the game directly but the audio sounded bad, so I'll just play some music I like throughout the video. I am dumb.
Now, let's start with the story. Okay, I'll be honest, I wasn't really paying attention to the plot that much when I was playing, and I wasn't really able to find any synopsis online, so I'll just read the story that it shows at the very beginning. Being human in this world is a curse. The lack of mana energy in our bodies doomed us forever. Mana is what rules our world. It is power in its purest form. Our only choice after we are born is to surrender to a life of slavery to those who wield mana, which is not so different from the life we have hidden out there. Many of us are killed whenever our encampments and villages are found. But this time was different. They came to destroy, but no one died that night. Specific humans were chosen and taken away from their families. That's when some of us decided to hit back. And then the game starts. You start your adventure as this fellow with a bow and arrow, named the Hunter, and you run around trying to save the kidnapped humans at the encampments and villages mentioned earlier. It's a fairly standard story, but it goes a lot deeper than I thought it would. All across the dungeon's rooms, there are shelves of books scattered around that give some insight on the mana experiments that the big evil guys are doing on their captives. Some of them you even end up encountering on your escapades, although they've definitely seen better days. While there are plenty of these bookshelves scattered around, I will say one thing in regard to them that don't make no sense to me. Why would you have a room in your game named The Library, but have no books to read in it? Now don't get me wrong, there are definitely books in the library, but they're all written in a language you can't understand, quote unquote. It feels like the perfect place to put lore, especially since there's a boss in that room and it would make that knowledge feel earned. But that's just a Goose thing, I guess. I wasn't exactly super enveloped in the story anyways. I just like killing the guys. All of them make a super satisfying sound when they get killed. Overall, the story's okay, but not really for me, even if it seems to go deep. I will say that the whole fantasy genre is kind of bloated, but I haven't really seen a story so focused on the usage of a magical source like mana, at least in this way. They end up doing their own thing with it, so it's alright in my book. This is my first dungeon crawler type of game I've ever played, so let me just say, this game took an embarrassing amount of time for me to finish. Not to say that the game is insanely hard, I'm just really bad at video games. That's actually one of Mana Spark's positive qualities. It's a nice introduction to the genre. Let me see if I can explain with some examples. Enter the Gungeon's average bit of gameplay is like this, whereas Mana Spark's average gameplay is more like this. Mana Spark's gameplay is much less chaotic than the bullet hell complexity of Enter the Gungeon, which makes it a good game from this genre to start with. The game as a whole is rather small, being only about 3 levels, and it could be plowed through in under an hour, but if you're just starting the game, it'll take you much longer. During your adventure, the enemies you encounter can interact with each other in unique ways that add new levels of challenge, like how the bat guys can ride on top of the wolves or boars and shoot their slingshots as they ride along. On top of that, the game will pair different enemies with unique behaviors in the same room for added difficulty. The idea of the character interaction starts off simple, but becomes complicated quick once you enter a room of enemies and have to figure out how to deal with the different characteristics of each enemy separately. There are a lot more interactions that I don't want to spoil, so check out how in-depth this game gets if you want to play it for yourself. Before I start talking about the general gameplay, allow me to summarize how the average run of this game will go. You'll spawn in this little forest and, after hacking and slashing a couple of enemies, collect an ability from one of these glowing chests, whether it be an attack increase, speed boost, more health, luck, or what have you. Then you go into what is called a peculiar room, which stores the runes you've collected up to that point. Oh, I forgot to mention, runes are used for all sorts of things, but to make a long story short, you can use them to make yourself stronger permanently and speed up the gameplay. You can also use the coins you've collected during the beginning to buy more perks, and even an additional ability, ranging anywhere from a bear trap to a health potion. After leaving that small rest area, you'll continue running around the randomly generated rooms of each floor, defeating enemies that are placed all over and collecting more coins and runes for the next peculiar room you encounter. After a little while, you may end up encountering a new room with new enemies. But then you'll end up getting killed by an enemy or boss you've never seen before because they did a stupid amount of damage twice and you couldn't figure out how to defeat them in time. And yes, I'm pulling from personal experience because it happened quite a few times. And it was very frustrating. So you'd die and get mocked by this lady, which is an insult to injury for real. Then you'd get spawned back to the encampment to try all over again, starting off as strong as you were in the beginning and losing all your perks and weapons. But that's not necessarily the only thing you can do. You could also get into the action faster by trying your luck, which is just starting over with a random ability, a random extra perk, and a random character. Oh yeah, did I mention there are other playable characters? I was not a huge fan of the Hunter. His shooting cooldown is kinda long, and his dodge roll has this weird lag on it that stops me from my tracks and feels janky. That's why I'm glad there are different characters for the gameplay variety. You'll have to find these new characters for yourself as you search deeper through the dungeons, much like the other NPCs at the encampment. I will say that each character plays much more differently and requires a whole new strategy. My favorite character to play by far is Wyatt, the night guy who replaces arrows and dashes with a sword and shield respectively. He cleans up dungeons much faster than the others, and it's probably why all the speedruns I saw were using him. One small complaint about the gameplay I have is that you can't go right back into gameplay if you don't want to try your luck, having to exit to the encampment then walk back to the dungeon door each time. It isn't that time consuming, but it feels like it would have been easy to just let you start over faster, instead of trying your luck for a quick restart. Why not just put the same kind of shortcut for a normal restart and have a separate option for going back to the camp? It's not a huge gripe, but I think it would be more convenient if you could do that. Also, I can't think of where to put this, but the minimap in the corner is very helpful. It shows you stuff you've left in rooms you've cleared, and allows you to teleport to cleared rooms, which is very helpful if you get stuck behind something or glitch somewhere, which actually happened to me during one of my early playthroughs. The random room generation I mentioned earlier gives the game quite a bit of replayability, which is good for a game, especially one like this where you'll be playing a large portion of the game several times. But I use the term randomly generated lightly, because it seems like it's just the same handful of rooms scattered across each area randomly. At least that's what I got from my experience. There's also a lot of objects in the rooms that make them feel natural, rather than just the randomly generated ones and zeros they are. They add a lot of atmosphere to the game, and makes it feel much more like a real place. And I do appreciate the attention to detail, but they're just in the way constantly. You can interact with these objects, so that means they'll block your path in some cases. And you know what that means? You're running around trying to avoid an attack and thinking you can just run through one of these things, but oh no, you can't, and you end up getting killed because you couldn't figure out a way out. These things have ended up killing me more times than I'm proud to admit, because I couldn't get out of the way of an attack in time. And this happened quite a few times. The last thing I expected to be a big threat in this game is the furniture, honestly. There's also apparently some glitchiness involved with the corners of rooms, but I'd never really experienced any of that. What I did experience were some different glitches, involving bosses getting frozen for no reason and making them super easy, graphics going wonky, and weird audio glitches where the sounds of enemies would keep playing even after I die. There was also something about super long load times, but I never experienced that in my playthrough. Though, it takes a moment in the beginning, but I won't hold that against the game. The boss battles aren't too bad, but normal combat with some of the mini-bosses and basic enemies devolves into just either shooting them or dodging and hitting. Again, not very hard, just simple, which makes it a good starting game for beginners of this genre. Like me. Now for my biggest gripe. The lag spikes. The game lags a lot whenever there are a multitude of enemies on the screen, and there's a small lag spike when you clear the last enemy out of a room. This is because how fast you go changes depending on whether you're in an empty room or a room with enemies. These lag spikes are especially apparent as you get later into the game when enemies just completely cloud the screen. It's also super apparent in handheld mode, which I do not recommend playing on, and I'll explain why later. I really don't understand the lag spikes, but it's not a super game-breaking problem. Just a minor annoyance that only got really noticeable a handful of times. So, it's whatever. So, another old-school pixel game, huh? Well, sort of. It's an old-styled game in terms of the sprites, with the characters nearing Atari levels of simplicity. And, honestly, I think that's to the game's detriment. Because I didn't have any sort of face or description of what they looked like, excluding a couple of sprites, I ended up forgetting a lot of the characters' names and appearance, just calling them by what they do or their weapons. Like, walk over to this guy? Oh, that's the chef food guy. The crossbow girl with the special dash? Oh, that's Tracer. Oh, this eyeball thing here? That's the knowledge. Well, of course I'm gonna remember its name if it's gonna show it to me every time I start the boss battle. Anyways, back to the style. There is one aspect I like about these characters, and that's their art. It shows up when you're choosing them, on the title screen, and the intro sequence as well. This art looks absolutely beautiful, and I really wish they went with that style for the whole game. It would have felt more original, and I would have been able to tell the characters apart, and probably remember them better. Another major problem with the game's graphics is that the character sprites are too small and similar looking from afar to play on the go. I tried to play it on the Switch in handheld mode on a table, and I couldn't see a thing unless I got right up to the tiny screen. But that doesn't mean it's much better in docked mode. I ended up not knowing where items, enemies, or coins were because they'd get hidden behind a wall or a tree or a corpse or something. I'm begging you, please only play this game on your TV in docked mode. It's probably for the best. Although, this probably isn't an issue on PC. The Switch's teeny tiny screen is to blame, most likely. I do think the backgrounds look very good though. The whole game has a gloomy color scheme that adds a dreary atmosphere I ended up enjoying immensely. The pixel art of the dungeons looks rather nice, and there are all kinds of little graphical touches that modernize the game, like how arrows shot across a puddle will disrupt the water, or how you can put out lit torches with your arrows, or how you can make puddles by stepping in the water, or the leaves that blow by in the foreground in the first area, stuff like that. Now this is just a small stylistic gripe for me, but I have to say it's rather strange how the whole game is in a pixelated style, but the text is in Times New Roman. But in the end, I'm glad they didn't go for the basic classic video game font that I hate. I'd take New Roman over that any day. To summarize, the game's aesthetic is gloomy and tense, which is good for a game where you're constantly jumping from place to place, avoiding enemies and shooting arrows in battles where you're trying to save your loved ones. I will say though, the simplicity of the art causes some of the characters' personality to be wiped away completely. And the simplicity of the sprites kind of reminds me of a game I mentioned earlier. Mana Spark does have a similar simplistic and pixelated style to Enter the Gungeon, but it's taken to a whole nother level in Mana Spark, as only the important details are left in the sprites. The larger sprites of the Enter the Gungeon characters give them more expressiveness and personality, which made me remember the game's characters a lot easier, even though I've hardly ever played Gungeon. In the end, Mana Spark kind of lacks the charm and style Enter the Gungeon has, which can mean a lot in the long run, since you'll be playing the game for a long time. It still has its own charm, don't get me wrong, but I can really tell what's going on a lot more often in Gungeon gameplay rather than Mana Spark. Which is ironic considering how chaotic Enter the Gungeon can be sometimes. I can appreciate how they managed to still make the sprites easy to understand despite being so small. I was hardly ever confused as to what an enemy was doing because their sprite easily explained their actions. That doesn't make it easy to see far away, just makes it easy to understand up close. The music in this game is pretty good. As I stated earlier, I couldn't really find any music from the game online, so I had to scrape it up from the game myself. The soundtrack isn't very big, but neither is the game, so it's no problem. It's a rather calm soundtrack for a game like this, but that's compensated for by the fact that the music in this game has a level of dynamicness to it. Is that a word? Dynamicness? Anyways, some drums will play in the song if you're in a room with enemies in it, and it fades back to the normal song when the room is cleared, which is a nice touch. Although, there was one time when I was playing where the music got horribly unsynchronized with the drums, and it was very jarring. It only happened once, so it probably doesn't happen often, which I'm thankful for. I also like how in the peculiar rooms, the music of where you just were becomes muffled. It really expresses that it's an in-between, almost a break between battles. Some specific tidbits I like from this game's music is the clarinet of the Encampment theme. It feels very solemn and almost sorrowful, which fits into the theme of the story. My favorite track is probably the theme of the buried tunnels. It's very serene and curious, despite being filled with orcs, skeletons, and spiders. I enjoy it very much. I like it a lot. Not much else to say about the music. It does its job very well, and I enjoy the songs. I will say that the DLC for Mana Spark was not what I was expecting. I thought it would be something small, like an additional game mode or something. Well, technically it is, but I'll get into that in a moment. Oh yeah, quick warning. Kind of spoilers? I mean, it does add stuff to the game, but it isn't mandatory to buy, and I don't really go into it that much in this video. I just want to make sure that nobody gets mad at me for reviewing a game in a game review video. Moving on. The Forgotten Crypts DLC came out in March of 2020, and had quite a bit of content in it. I don't want to talk too much about it, so I'll just summarize. It adds one new character, the Boomerang Girl, who also fights with her pet dog, a whole new level to explore, with new enemies to fill it, some new perks to unlock, and a new NPC for some special upgrades. It also adds some extra stuff to the story, but it isn't super mandatory. I will say it does give the story a sense of finality, and it feels like a proper, complete ending now. On top of all this, the Forgotten Crypts DLC is free if you already have the original game, which is honestly probably few people, since I haven't been able to find much stuff about this game, like I said earlier. The most exciting feature is that it also adds multiplayer. Player 2 can play as the Boomerang Girl's wolf, and that's it. Sure, the wolf can bite and petrify enemies, and run around wherever he wants, but all it's meant to be is a Sonic and Tails dynamic in terms of gameplay. It's what you'd give to your little brother if you both wanted to play, which is exactly what I did, because having a player 2 trivializes most of the challenge in Mana Spark. The fact that the co-op mode is almost brain-dead easy isn't a huge issue to me. It's just supposed to be a more casual Mana Spark experience, so I can't really complain. Also, you can't do a quick restart for multiplayer either, which is a shame. I thought they might fix that with a DLC or an update or something, but that's alright. Basically, the Forgotten Crypts DLC doesn't feel like DLC. It just feels like part of the base game, which is both good and bad. It's good because it isn't disorienting, but it feels like it could have been in the game from the beginning and made it more worth its price tag. If you're gonna buy this game, I highly recommend buying the DLC along with it. Other than that, that's about it for the DLC. Now for my favorite moment of Mana Spark. It isn't exactly a particular scene or moment, rather, a type of moment that happened regularly throughout my runs in the dungeons. Let me help you visualize this. You're about 75% through a run, and you've already collected a bunch of perks and are yoked out as the knight, Wyatt. You enter a room full of weak enemies, and you immediately start hacking and slashing at them, mashing the attack button, going bonkers all over the enemies and knocking them out over the course of like 10 seconds or something. And in doing so, you collect a swath of coins and runes once the room is completed. It's a very satisfying feeling, and I'm glad it happened over and over again. It makes a goose feel quite powerful. Mana Spark is definitely solid, especially for the first game an indie company makes. I enjoyed the music, it looks good, and the gameplay was usually smooth and felt satisfying. Most of the time. However, this game is far from perfect. At first, I was all pumped up and motivated to reach the end of the game, but the more times I died to ridiculous stuff and kept having to deal with the occasional glitch or small annoyance, the more it started feeling like a chore to try and complete the game. Don't get me wrong, I had a lot of fun playing this game for the most part, but the frustrating, monotonous, and straining little tidbits added up, and ended up leaving a bad taste in my mouth towards the end. Or I might just be bad at the game. Overall, I'll give Mana Spark on its own a rating of 5 out of 10. It's a fine game on its own, but in comparison to games like it, it's outclassed due to its similarity graphics-wise, its bugs, and its slew of imperfections in general. I'll cut Behemoth some slack though. If you buy it with the DLC, it's more like a 6 out of 10. It's their first game, and it isn't bad for what it is at all. Just a little bit rough around the edges. In the end, I'm excited to see what they make in the future. This video is at the request of one of my commenters who happens to be a friend of mine. So to that one friend, Merry Christmas, buddy. And speaking of the comments, while you're here, why not tell me what you think of Mana Spark, or what other games you want me to check out in another video? Anyways, my name is Goose, I thank you very much for watching, and have a happy Christmas. Whenever that is. Now go away!